Hey guys, JD here. Coming up, I can't wait to share with you some of the greatest stories ever told by the master storyteller herself, Granny Tollett. Come right in here and set a spell. I was just wishing I had somebody to talk to. Take that chair right by the door so you can catch the breeze. She beamed over at me and hitched her chair a little to one side in order to give me the full benefit of the wind that was blowing through the screen porch door. The mountain air was full of fragrances from a field of clover that lay in full bloom just across the dirt road. For it was June in East Tennessee, and clover, as well as the mountain laurel, were running sweet wide over Husky Branch. Granny always liked to tell stories while she was shelling beans, and me, I was a sponge that loved to listen. She moved the wash tub between our two chairs, and I picked up a handful of beans to help her out. She smiled and said, "Did I ever tell you the story of Miss Sally Ann?" as her slender, wrinkled fingers split the hull of yet another bean pod. "No, ma'am, I don't believe you have." Granny Tollett sat silent for a few moments. She always made this pause before beginning a story, and to me, as a little boy, there was something impressive about it, as she summoned the storytelling ability that few folks possessed. And within a moment, she began. It was about 40 years ago, and our church was in a terrible need of a fix. The roof was leaking, some of the windows needed replaced, and the floor was just as bare as your hand, like it always had been. Anyways, the men folk managed to get the roof shingled and the windows fixed, and us women concluded that we would get some new carpet. We'd been saving our money for some time, and we had about $12. And I recollect the argument that we had. Some of us wanted to spend it on the carpet, while some women wanted to give it to those foreign missions, as we had originally set out to do in the first place. Me, the way I figured it, if any of those heathen folk failed to hear the gospel on account of us getting this carpet, they'd probably get saved anyhow, somehow up the road. And if we did send the money for missions, they might not repent, and they'd certainly be damned. So it seemed to me, as long as we weren't sure what they were going to do, we might as well keep the money and get that carpet. With the vote split right down the middle, Sally Ann was the one who settled it, and she cast the final vote in favor of the carpet. Well, anyhow, we all decided to take Sally Ann's advice, and we started about appointing a committee to go to town the following Monday and pick out the carpet, when all at once, the group's treasurer, Elizabeth Taylor, spoke up and said, "There ain't no use in appointing that committee. The money's gone. I kept it in my top drawer at home, and when I went for it yesterday, it was gone. I'll pay it back if I'm ever able to, but I ain't able now." And with that, she got up and she walked out of the room. Before anyone could say a word, we seen her going down the road with her head hanging low. And we just sat there and stared at each other in sort of a dazed way. I could see that everybody was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say a word, till suddenly our preacher's wife, who was just as good a woman as anyone ever lived, she spoke up and she said, "Judge not." And them two words was just like a sermon to us. And then Sally Ann spoke up and said, "For the Lord's sake, don't tell them men folk anything about this. They're always saying that us women ain't fit to handle money, and I, for one, don't want to give them any more ground to stand on than they already got." So we all agreed to say nothing about it, and we all kept our promise, except for that Millie Amos. She had mighty little sense to begin with, and having been married only about 2 months, she'd lost what little sense she had. So directly the next morning, I happened to meet Sam Amos walking down the road, and he says to me, "Miss Tollett, how much money have you women got towards that new carpet for the church?" And I looked at him square in the face and I said, "Are you a member of the ladies group of Harmony Chapel Church, Mr. Sam Amos? For if you are, you already know how much money we got. And if you ain't, well then you got no business knowing. And furthermore, while there may be some women folk who can't keep a secret and a promise, dagnabbit, I ain't one of them." And that settled him quick. Well, Elizabeth never showed her face outside her door for more than a month afterwards, and a more pitiful creature you never saw than when she finally came to the prayer meeting. She sat way back in the church, and she was as pale and as weak as she had been through a siege of typhoid. And I recollect it all just like it was yesterday. We sung the sweet hour of prayer, and Brother Parson Page prayed. And then he called on the brethren to say anything they might feel called to say concerning their experience in the past week. Old Uncle Jim Matthews began to clear his throat, and I knew just as well as my name he was finna get up and tell how precious the Lord had been to his soul, just like he had been doing every Wednesday night for 20 years. But before he got started, here come Elizabeth walking down the side aisle, and she stopped right in front of the pulpit. "I've got something to say," she began. "It's been on my mind till I can't stand it any longer, and I've got to tell it, or I'll go crazy. It was me that took that carpet money. I only meant to borrow it, and I thought surely I'd be able to pay it back before it was wanted. But things went wrong, and I ain't known a peaceful minute since, and I never shall again, I reckon. I took it to pay my way up to Louisville. That time I got the news that my daughter Mary was dying. Now you see, Mary was her only child from her first marriage to Tom Watkins. You know that fella that was killed in the logging accident." Elizabeth went on. "I begged my husband Jacob to give me the money to go on, but he wouldn't do it, and I tried to get the thought of going to see her out of my head, but I just couldn't. Mary was all I had in the world, and maybe some of you that have children can put yourself in my place and know what it would be like to hear your only child calling to you from their deathbed, and you not being able to go see them. I asked my husband 3 times for the money, and when I found out he wouldn't give it to me, I said to myself, well, I'm going anyhow. I got down on my knees, and I asked the Lord to show me a way, and I felt sure he would. The next day, as soon as my husband got up and ate his breakfast and had gone out to the farm, I dressed myself, and as I opened the top drawer to get out my best dress, I saw the missionary money. $12. It came right to my head that maybe this was the answer to my prayer. Maybe I could just borrow this money and pay it back some way or other before it was called for. I tried to put it out of my head, but the thought just kept coming back. And when I went down to the sitting room, I happened to look up at the mantel above the fireplace, and I saw those brass candlesticks with the prisms all around them that used to belong to my mother. And all at once, I seemed to see just what the Lord intended for me to do. You know, I had a boarder that stayed with us the summer before last, that lady from Louisville, and she said she wanted those candlesticks the worst kind, and she offered me $15 for them. But I wouldn't part with them then. But she said if I ever took the notion to sell them, to let her know, and she left her name and address on a card. So I went to my big Bible and I got out that card, and I packed the candlesticks and I put on my bonnet. When I opened the door, I looked up the road, and the first thing I saw was Dave Crawford coming along in his new buggy. And he drew up and he asked me if I was going to town, and he said he'd take me. To me, it looked like the Lord was leading me all the time. But the way things turned out, it must have been Satan. I got to my daughter Mary just 2 hours before she died, and she looked up at my face and she said, Mama, I knew God wouldn't let me die until I saw you once more. I tell you now, the church brethren grew quiet and the shuffling of boots ceased, and here and there, some of the women folk took off their glasses and they were wiping their eyes. Elizabeth went on. I can't say this without crying to save my life, but the truth is, Elizabeth never shed a tear. To me, she looked like she had gotten past crying, and she talked straight on just as she had made up her mind to say just so much. And she said she'd die if she didn't get to say so. As soon as the funeral was over, I set out to find that lady who wanted the candlesticks, but she wasn't home. Her niece was there, and she told me she had heard her aunt speak of the candlesticks often, and that she'd be home in a few days and would send me the money right on. I came home thinking that everything was going to be all right, and I kept expecting that money every day, but it never did come before yesterday. I wrote her 3 times about it, and I never got a word back until Monday. She said she had just got home, and she hoped I hadn't been inconvenienced by the delay. She wrote a nice, polite letter, and she sent me a check for $15. And here it is. I wanted to confess to all the ladies that day we decided to buy the carpet, but somehow I couldn't until I had that money right back in my hand to pay back. If that lady had only come back when her niece said she was coming, it would have turned out right. But I reckon it's a judgment on me for meddling with the Lord's money. God only knows what I've suffered. But if I had to do it all over again, if I'm being honest, I believe I would. My Mary was the only child that I had in this world, and I had to see her once more before she went to the Lord. And I've been a member of this church for 20 years, but I reckon you'll have to turn me out now. That poor thing just stood there trembling and holding out that check, as if she expected somebody to come and take it. I saw Brother Silas Petty. Oh, he was glowering at her from under his eyebrows. And it put me in the mind of those Pharisees and that woman that they wanted to stone. And I recollect thinking, oh, Lord Jesus, if you would come right now and take her part. And while we sat there like a passel of mutes, Miss Sally Ann got up and marched down the middle aisle and stood right by Elizabeth. Well, I reckon if anybody's going to be turned out of this church on account of this miserable little money, it better be her husband Jacob and not Elizabeth. A man that won't give his wife money to go see her dying child is too mean to stay in a Christian church anyhow. And I'd like to know how it is that a woman who had $800 when she married him has to go to her husband and get down on her knees and beg for what's her own. Where's the money Elizabeth had when she married you? Is it down there on that 10-acre farm? I bet it is. Or is it in that new barn that you built last spring? A fine church elder you are, ain't you? Goodness knows what else she would have said, but just then, old Deacon Petty rose up and he was waving his arms up and down. This is just awful. If this woman wants to give her religious experience, why, of course she can. But when it comes to a woman standing up in the house of the Lord and belittling an elder as the way this woman's doing, why, I tremble for the Lord's house. Didn't the Apostle Paul say, let your women keep silent in the church? As soon as he named Apostle Paul, Sally Ann gave kind of a snort, because she was terribly free-spoken. And when Deacon Petty said that, she just squared herself like she intended to stand here to Judgment Day. The Apostle Paul has been dead rather too long for me to be afraid of him, and I never heard Apostle Paul appoint Deacon Petty to represent him at this church. Now, if Apostle Paul don't like what I'm saying, let him rise up from his grave in Corinthians, or Ephesians, or wherever it is he's buried, and let him say so. Because I'm telling you, I got a message from the Lord to the men folks of this church, and I'm going to deliver it. Paul or no Paul, she retorted. And as for you, Silas Petty, I haven't forgotten the time I dropped in to see Maria one Saturday night, and I found her washing her flannel petticoat and drying it before the fire. And every time I've had to hear you lead prayer ever since then, I've said to myself, Lord, how high can a man's prayer rise towards heaven if his wife ain't got but one flannel skirt to her name? No higher than the back of this pew, I tell you. And you say I can give my experience, can I? Well, that's just what I'm a-doing. And while I'm at it, I'm going to do some talking for Elizabeth and Maria and the rest of the women, too. If the Apostle Paul's got anything to say about a woman working like a slave for 25 years and then having to set up to wash her clothes on a Saturday night so she can go to church clean on Sunday morning, I'd like to hear it. But don't you dare say anything to me about keeping Silas in the church. There was times when Paul said he didn't know whether he had the Spirit of God or not, and I'm certain that when he wrote that text, he wasn't any more inspired than you are. Now, Job Taylor was sitting right in front of Deacon Petty, and I reckon he thought his time was coming next, so he got up all easy-like, with his red bandana on his mouth, and he started out. But as soon as he tried to start, Sally Ann headed him off before he'd even gone 6 steps, and she barked. There ain't anything the matter with you now, Job Taylor. You sit right down and hear what I got to say. I've knelt and stood through enough of your long-winded prayers, and now it's my time to talk and yours to listen. And bless your life if Job didn't sit down just as meek as Moses. And Sally went right into him. I reckon you're afraid I'm going to tell about some of your meanness, ain't you? And the only thing that stands in my way of doing it is there's so much to tell I don't know where to begin. Now, Job's sister-in-law, Mary, was sitting right behind me, and I heard her say, Amen, just as fervent as if somebody had been praying. And Job, he just sat there, looking like a sheepdog. Dave Crawford started shuffling his feet and clearing his throat while Sally Ann was talking to Job. Sally Ann heard his feet shuffling, and as soon as she got done with Job, she turned around and gave it to Dave. Do you think your hemming and hawing is going to stop me, Dave Crawford? I tell you, before it was over, Sally Ann had her say about nearly every man in the church. She told how Mary Ebery had to cut up her wedding skirts to make clothes for her first baby, and how John Martin had stopped Hannah one day when she was carrying her mother a pound of butter, and he made her go back and put the butter in the cellar, and how John Davison used to make Ann pay him for every bit of chicken feed, and then he'd take half of her egg money when the chickens got into his garden, and how Abner Page would give his wife 25 cents spending money every time she went to visit her sister. I tell you, that Sally Ann was a masterful sort of woman, and that night it seemed like she was possessed. The way she talked made me think about the day of Pentecost and the gift of tongues. And then she finally got to the preacher, and I'd been wondering all along if she was going to let him off. She turned around to where he was sitting behind the pulpit, and she said, Now, Brother Page, you're a good man, but you ain't so good that you couldn't be better. It was just last week that women folk came around begging money so you could buy a new suit of clothes to preach in. And I told 'em if it was to get your wife a new dress, I was ready to give. But not a dime if it was going to go towards putting some more finery on your back. I'm tired of seeing preachers walk up into the pulpit in their slick black broadcloths, and their wives sitting down in the pew with old black silk that's been turned upside down, wrong side out, and sponged and pressed and made over till you can't tell whether it's silk or anything else. And when it comes to the perseverance of the saints and the decrees of God, there ain't many who can preach a better sermon. But there's some of your sermons that ain't fit for much but kindling fires, like the one you preached last Sunday on the 21st verse of the 5th chapter of Ephesians. I reckon I've heard about 150 sermons on that text, and I reckon I'll keep on hearing them. Anybody would think that you preachers were struck blind every time you got through reading the 24th verse, for I never heard a sermon on the 25th verse, and I'm going to read the rest of it to you for once and all anyhow. And I'll be danged if Sally didn't walk right up into the pulpit, as if she had been ordained, and read what Paul said about men loving their wives as Christ loved the church, and just as they loved their own bodies. Well, I reckon Parson Page thought if he didn't head Sally Ann off, she'd go on all night. So when she stopped for a breath, he shut the big Bible and he quickly grabbed a hymn book and said, "Brethren, let us sing, blessed be the tie that binds." And with that, he struck up the tune himself. And about the middle of the first verse, the preacher's wife got up and went to where Elizabeth was standing to give her the right hand of fellowship. And then Miss Petty went and did the same. First thing we knew, we was all around shaking hands and hugging and crying over her. It was a regular love fest, and we all went home feeling like we had been through a big revival meeting and got religion all over again. Granny Tollett concluded her story and she smiled at me. In that moment, I realized that all the beans had been shelled. "Grandma, how about you and Papa Coy?" I asked. "Did Miss Sally Ann say anything about you two?" Granny Tollett's eyes snapped back with some fire from her long past youth. "Law, no, child," she said. "Papa Coy was never that kind of man, and I was never that kind of a woman. And as I recollect, we was walking home that night, and your papa said to me, all sort of humble-like, 'Well, Mama, I guess you better go get that new dress you was looking at down at Jenkins' General Store last week.' And I told your papa right then, 'Don't you worry about that dress, 'cause it's already a-laying in my bottom drawer right now.'"
I told y'all Granny was feisty. Stick around for more of the master storyteller, Granny Tollett. With the best of Granny Tollett, coming up, an absolute masterclass in storytelling. This is Miley's Boy.
It was a crisp fall morning as I topped the hill on that dirt path that led to my grandma's house. For long as I could remember, I always dropped by her house on Saturday mornings to see if she needed any help around the house. Plus, I knew there was a good chance of getting a belly full of fresh cookies while I was there. Just then, I saw Granny Tollett leaning back in her high-back rocker while she worked on a basket of knitting. "J.D., you got a nose on you like a coon dog. Seems like every time I do some baking, you come a-running." She gave me a quick smile and told me to pull up a chair next to her. Sure enough, she already had a covered plate of cookies waiting on my arrival. Just then, the sound of an engine could be heard on the main road that passed in front of Granny's property. Yonder comes William Elroy in his new car. Just look at him. I do believe he grows younger and handsome every day of his life. A sweet-faced woman sat beside him, and two pretty girls were in the seat behind him. Indeed, William Elroy looked every inch of a perfect specimen of a gentleman farmer of East Tennessee. "Who's that, Granny?" I asked. "Why, only the richest man in the county," Granny replied as she followed the vanishing car with her keen gaze. "He went to the legislature last winter. The Honorable William Elroy, they call him now. But I can remember a time when he was just Smiley Russell's boy. And there wasn't nothing honorable about him either. Boy, the stories I could tell you about him." I grabbed another cookie off the plate and said, "Well, tell me one." "Why, I hardly know just where to begin," Granny Tollett replied, wrinkling her forehead and adjusting her needles. "Telling a story is something like winding off a ball of yarn. There's just two ends of it, though if you can get a hold of the right one, it's easy work. But there's so many ways of beginning a story, you never know which one leads straightest to the point. Well, you asked me who William Elroy was. Well, he was the son of Bill Elroy, and Bill was the son of William Elroy, the old squire. It's curious to me how you can name two boys William, and one of them will always be called William, and the other one will always be called Bill. And I've noticed that you can tell what sort of a man a boy's gonna be just by knowing whether folks call him William or Bill. I ain't saying every William is a good man and every Bill is a bad one. All I mean is there's much difference between Bill and a William. Anyway, there's been a William in the Elroy family as far back as you could track them. And all of them were good, steady, God-fearing men. Until Bill came along. He was an only child, and of course that made a bad matter worse. Anyhow, I'll say this. There's some men that are just born to get women into trouble. And Bill was one of them. Just as handsome as a picture. And 2 years ahead of his age when it comes to size. And a way about him, from the time he put on his pants, that just showed what kind of a man he was cut out for. If the children were playing Jenny put the kettle on, he got kissed 10 times to any other boys once. And if we were playing drop the handkerchief, every little girl in the ring would be dropping behind Bill to get him to run after her. And that was the only time he ever did any running. All he had to do was just sit still, and the girls would do the running. He was that way all his life. The only girl that appeared to be anything like a match for him was Annie Crawford, Old Man Bob Crawford's daughter. Now, Old Man Bob was one of the kind that thinks the more children they got, the bigger men they are. And he was mighty proud of his sons, but he wanted a daughter more than anything. And when they kept turning out boys, he got crazier and crazier for a girl. Annie wasn't born till he was past 60 years old, and he like to lost his senses with joy. Well, of course, Annie was bound to be spoiled, especially after her mother died when she was just 4 years old. On top of that, Old Man Bob raised all his boys on the spare the rod, spoil the child principle. But when Annie came along, he turned his back on old Solomon and gave out that Annie mustn't be crossed by anybody. Well, Annie was a headstrong, high-tempered child to begin with, and having nobody to control her, she got to be the worst youngin', I reckon, in the whole state of Tennessee. I used to feel right sorry for her brothers. They couldn't keep a top or a ball or a marble or any plaything to save their lives. Annie would cry for them just for pure meanness. And whatever it was that Annie cried for, they had to give it to her or get a whipping. As soon as she got old enough, Old Man Bob carried her with her everywhere he went. On county court days, you could see him going along on his big gray mare, with Annie behind him, holding on to the sides of his coat with her little fat hands. And in the evening, about sunset, here they'd come, Annie on the front, fast asleep, and Old Man Bob holding her with one arm and guiding his horse with the other. Harvesting times, Annie'd be out there in the field sitting on a stack of wheat and ordering the hands around, as if she was some kind of overseer. And Old Man Bob would just stand back and shake his sides, laughing and say, "That's right, honey. Make 'em move lively. If it wasn't for you, Pappy couldn't get his harvesting done." Every fall and spring, he'd go to town and buy clothes for her. And people used to say the storekeepers laid out extra stock just for Old Man Bob. He'd walk into Tom Baker's store with the saddlebags on his arm and holler out, "Bring out your finest silk, boys. And remember that the best ain't good enough for my little gal." Well, when Annie was about 12 years old, he took her off to Jefferson City to get her education. When he come to say goodbye to her, he cried, and then she cried, and it ended with him sitting down and staying for about 3 weeks in Jefferson City, just waiting for little Annie to get over her homesickness. I tell you, folks never did quit laughing about him going off to boarding school. As soon as Sam Crawford saw him, he said, "Well, Uncle Bob, when do you reckon you'll get your diploma?" I shall never forget the first time Annie came home to spend Christmas. The neighbors didn't have any peace in their lives for Old Man Bob telling them how Annie had growed and how there wasn't a gal in the state that could hold a candle to her. And Sunday, he come walking into church with Annie hanging on his arm. He was just so proud and happy. It's like he'd got a new wife. I reckon Annie had improved. And it wasn't just her looks. She was always as pretty as a picture. But she was now nice-mannered and just well-behaved as a girl you'd want to see. There was just as much difference between her and what she used to be as there is between a tame fox and a wild one. Of course, the wildness is all still there, but kind of covered up under the cute little tricks and ways. And that's the way it was with Annie. Now, William Elroy's pew was just across the aisle from Old Man Bob's, and I could see Bill watching Annie during the church. But Annie never looked one way or the other. She just sat there with her hands folded and her eyes straight, and nobody would have ever thought that she'd been riding horses bareback or climbing rail fences ever since she could walk. And when she came back from school in June, it was the same thing over again. Old Man Bob bragging on her, saying how sweet and pretty she was, and Bill began to wait on her right away. And before long, folks was saying that they was made for each other, especially since their farms joined one another. Now that's a fool's notion, but you can't get it out of some people's heads. Well, things went on this way for about 2 or 3 years. Annie going and coming and getting prettier all the time. And Bill waiting on her whenever she was at home and carrying on between times with every girl in the neighborhood. At last, Annie came home for good, and Bill dropped all the others in a hurry and set out in earnest to get Annie. Folks said he was mightily in love, but according to my way of thinking, there wasn't any love about it. The long and the short of it was that Annie knew how to manage him, while all the other girls didn't. They was always right there in the neighborhood, and it don't help a woman to always be under a man's nose. But Annie was here and there and everywhere, visiting in town and Knoxville, and bringing the town folks and the city folks home with her, and having dances and picnics, and doing all she could to make Bill jealous. Now, I always believed that Annie was just as crazy about Bill as the rest of the girls, but she had sense enough not to let him know it. It's human nature, you know, to want things that's hard to get. Why, I reckon if fleas and mosquitoes were scarce, folks would go a-hunting them and making a big fuss over them. And Annie had made herself hard to get, and that's why Bill wanted her so bad. Everybody was saying what a blessed thing it was, and how Bill would give up his wild ways and settle down. Well, along in the spring, a year after Annie had got through with school, Sally Ann came to me and she said, "Miss Tollett, I saw something last night, and it's been bothering me ever since." And she went on to say how she was going home about dusk, and how she had seen Bill and Miley Russell at the turn of the road that used to lead up to Miley's house. And they was standing underneath a wild cherry tree by the fence corner, and the elderberry bushes were so thick that all you could see was Bill's head and shoulders and the top of Miley's head. But they looked to be mighty close together, and Bill was stooping over and whispering something to her. Well, now that set me to thinking. I recollect seeing Bill coming down the lane one evening about sunset, about the same time that I caught sight of Miley, walking away in the other direction. The women's group met at church the next day, and Sally Ann and me brought it up to the group. So we talked it over. And it come out that every woman in there had seen the same things we'd been seeing, but nobody had really said anything about it to the others because they weren't certain. Well, something ought to be done about this, Sally Ann said. It'd be a shame to let that poor child go to destruction right before our eyes, when a word from us might save her. Young Miley is fatherless and pretty much motherless too. You see, Miley's family were tenants of old Squire Elroy, and after Miley's father died of consumption, the old squire just let them live there, just the same as before. Miss Elroy would give them quilting and sewing to do, and they had their little garden, and they managed to get along just well enough. Now some folks called them poor white trash, and they was poor enough, goodness knows, but they was just as clean and hard working, and that's two things that trash never is. I used to hear that Miley's mother came from a good family, but she had married beneath herself and got down in the world, like folks always do when they're cast off by their own people. Miley had come up like a wild rose in a fence corner, and she was just the kind of girl to be fooled by a man like Bill, handsome and smooth talking, with all the ways and the manners that take women in. Emily Crawford used to say that it made her feel just like a queen just to see Bill take his hat off to her. But I tell you, if men's manners matched their hearts, honey, it'd be a heap easier world for us women. But whenever you see a man that's got good manners and a bad heart, you know there's trouble ahead for some woman. Well, anyway, us women folks talked it over till dark, and we all agreed that something needed to be done. But you know how it is when everybody's business is nobody's business. I thought Sally Ann would go and talk to Miley and give her a word of warning, and Sally Ann thought that I'd do it, and so it went. In the end, nothing was said, and before long, it was all over the neighborhood that poor little Miley was pregnant. Some of the men folk did try to talk to old man Bob, but law, child, you might as well have been talking to the east wind. All he would say is if little Annie wants Bill Elroy, she's gonna have him. And that's what he'd been saying ever since Annie was born. Nobody said anything to Annie, and she was the sort of girl who didn't care whose feelings she trampled on, if she just got her own way. So it went on, and the wedding day was set, and nothing was talked about but Annie's first day dress and her second day dress, and how many ruffles she had on her petticoats, and what the lace on her nightgowns cost, And all that time, there was poor Miley Russell, crying her eyes out, night and day, and all us women folk getting up our old baby clothes for Bill Elroy's unborn child. Annie always said she was going to have a wedding that this county had never seen. And she kept her word. Old man Bob had the house fixed up inside and out. They sent up to Maryville for the cakes and things. And the wedding cake was 3 feet high. There was a solid gold ring on it, and the bridesmaids cut it, and every girl there had a slice of the bride's cake to carry home and dream on that night. Annie's wedding dress was white satin, and it was so heavy that it would stand on its own. Annie and Bill were married in October, about the time the leaves fell, and Miley's boy was born the last of November. Lord, what a world this is. Old man Bob wouldn't hear of Annie leaving him, so they stayed right in the old home place. In them days, folks didn't go eloping all over creation as soon as they got married. They settled down to housekeeping like sensible folks ought to. Old Lady Elroy, she was just as foolish over Bill as old man Bob was over Annie. So it was laid down beforehand that they was to spend half their time at old man Bob's and half the time at Squire's. And that was about the worst thing they could have done. The further a young couple can get from the old folks on both sides, the better it is for everybody concerned. And besides, Annie wasn't the type of girl to get along with Bill's mother. A girl with the kind of raising Annie had wasn't any fit for a daughter-in-law, and especially for a high-stepping woman like old Lady Elroy. Now, there were some people that expected a heap better of Bill after he married, but I never did. If a man can't be faithful to a woman before he marries her, he ain't likely to be faithful after he marries her. And sure enough, before the shine was off of Annie's wedding clothes, Bill was back to his old ways of drinking and a carrying on with all the women, the same as ever. And the first thing we knew, him and Annie had a big quarrel, and old man Bob had ordered him off his place. But they made up, and they went over to the old Squire's to live. And things went well enough until Annie's baby was born. And Bill had his heart set on having a boy. But it turned out a girl. And as soon as they told him that, he never even asked how Annie was. He just went out to the stable and saddled his horse and galloped off. And nobody seen him for 2 days. Now, he didn't have to take on like that, for the poor little baby didn't live but a week. Annie had convulsions over Bill leaving her that way, and the doctor said that's what killed the child. And I tell you, Annie was never the same after that. She grieved for her child, and she lost her good looks. And when she lost them, she lost Bill. It wasn't long before Bill was living with his father, and she was living with hers. At last, he went out west, and in less than 3 years, Annie died. And it's a good thing she did, for a more soured, disappointed woman couldn't have been found anywhere. Well, all this time, Miley's baby was growing in grace, and a finer child never was born. Miley had named him William, and nature had wrote his father's name all over him. He was the living image of Bill, but the look in his eyes, oh, that was Miley's, and she worshipped him. And there were few children that were ever raised more careful and better than Miley's boy. And that's what we always called him. Miley was nothing but a child herself when he was born. But all at once, she appeared to turn into a woman. And she acted and she looked like one. And Granny Tollett paused for a moment, and she looked over at me. It ain't time, honey, that makes people old. It's experience. Some folks never get over being children, and some never had any childhood. And poor little Miley, hers was cut short by trouble. If she ever felt ashamed of herself or the child, nobody ever knew it. I never could tell if it was a lack of sense or just she just looked at things different than the rest of us. But to see her walking into church, nobody would have ever thought that she was anything but a lawful wife. No woman could have behaved better than she did, I'm bound to say. And she got better looking all the time. And she was just as steady and sober as if she'd been 60 years old. It seems right strange to talk about dignity in a poor girl who had made a misstep like she did. But I reckon that's what made us all come to treat her as if she was just as good as anybody. Honey, people can set their own price on themselves, I've noticed. And if they keep it set, folks will come up to it. And Miley didn't seem to think she had done anything wrong. And when she brought little William up to the baptism, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. And when she joined the church herself, there wasn't anybody mean enough to say a word against it. Not even Silas Petty. Well, old Squire Elroy gave her the cottage rent-free after her mother died. And between nursing and doing fine needlework, she made a good living for her and the boy. And little William was a child worth working for from the start, tall and straight as a sapling, and carried himself like he owned the earth. Even when he was just a little fella, it looked like all the good blood on both sides had come out in him. And there wasn't a smarter, more handsome boy in the county. The old squire thought a heap of him, and it wasn't nothing but his pride that kept him from owning the child outright and treating him like he was his own flesh and blood. William had an old head on young shoulders, and he was just as full of life as any boy. And by the time he was grown, the old squire trusted him with everything on the place and looked at him just the same as if he had been a settled man. Well, all these years, nobody ever heard nothing from Bill. Every once in a while, somebody would come to town and say they'd seen him, or somebody that looked like him. Some folks would say that they heard Bill was out in California, or Lord knows where. That's all the news that would ever come back. We had all just about made up our minds that he was dead, when one morning, along in the corn planting time, the news was brought and spread all over the neighborhood, in no time, that Bill Elroy had come home to his father's and was lying at the point of death. Just like the prodigal son, after 20 years. It takes some folks a long time, child, to get tired of the swine and the husk. Well, of course, it made a big commotion. And before we'd hardly taken it in, we heard that he had sent for Miley. Now, we had a young traveling preacher that summer, and as soon as he heard about Bill, he went up to the big house without being sent for to talk to him about his soul. I reckon he thought it would be a feather in his cap if he could convert a hardened sinner like Bill. He sat down beside his bed and he began laying off a plan of salvation, just like he was preaching from the pulpit. And Bill listened and never took his eyes off of his face. And when the preacher got through, Bill said, "Do you mean to tell me that all I've got to do to keep out of hell and to get into heaven is to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ?" And Brother Jonas said, "That's right, my dear friend. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved." And just then, Bill began to laugh a curious sort of laugh. "It's a mighty fine God that would make such a bargain as that. But let me tell you something, preacher man. I was born bad, and I've lived bad, and I'm dying bad. And I ain't no coward or no sneak, and I'm going to hell for my sins, like a man. Like a man, do you hear me?" The look in his eyes was just awful, and the preacher turned white as a sheet. It sure was some curious talk for a deathbed. But when you come to think about it, it's reasonable enough that when a man's got hell in his heart, what good is it going to do to get him into heaven? Now, when we all heard that Miley had been sent for, the first thing we thought, how on earth is Miley going to tell young William all he's got to know about his father? And they said that Bill nearly gasped when Miley came walking into the room. I reckon he expected to see the same little girl that he had fooled some 20 years ago. And when she came walking in, it just took him by surprise. "Why, Miley, is that you?" Miley was so gentle and sweet looking, and there he was, all wore out and bad living and wasted to a shadow of what he used to be. I've seen the same thing, child, over and over again. Two people who start out together, and after a while, they'll get separated, or maybe they'll live together a lifetime. And when they get to the end of 15 or 20 or 25 years, one of them will be just where they were when they started out, and the other one will be way up and way on. And then all of a sudden, they're just strangers after all. And that's the way it was with Miley and Bill. They had been sweethearts, and there was the child. But the father had gone his way, and the mother had gone hers. And now there was nothing between them, and there was a gulf just as big as the one the Bible talks about. Well, Bill looked up at Miley like a hungry man looks at bread, and he says, "Miley, I'm going to make an honest woman out of you." And Miley just looked at him in his eyes and said just as gentle and easy as if she'd been talking to a sick child, "I've always been an honest woman, Bill." And this kind of took him back, and he said right earnest and pitiful, "I want to marry you, Miley. Don't refuse me. I want to do one decent thing before I die. I've come all the way from California just for this. Surely you'll feel better if you're my lawful wife." And Miley just stood there for a moment. "Bill, I'm only here so my son can see his father just once with his own eyes." So Miley went and called William in. And as soon as Bill saw him, he raised up on an elbow, as weak as he was, and he hollered out so loud that you could hear him in the next room, "Why, it's myself. It's me. Stand off there where I can see you, boy. Why, you're the man I ought to have been and I couldn't be. These lying doctors, They say that I ain't got but a day to live, but I'm gonna live another lifetime in you." And then he fell back, gasping for breath. All the while, young William stood there in the middle of the floor, with his arms folded and his face looking like it was made out of stone. "Boy, won't you shake hands with your father?" But William never stirred, and Miley got up and she went to him, and she laid her hand on her son's arm. "Son, won't you come speak to your father?" Finally, young William walked up to Bill and took his poor wasted hand in his strong one, and he looked sternly into his eyes. "Just to be clear, I'm only here to support my mama, just like I always have. I'm the person that I am today because of her." And them were the only words he said to his father, and he turned and he left. The doctor said Bill would live through the night, and sure enough, he begun to sink just as soon as young William and Miley left, and he died the next morning about daybreak. Miley didn't live long after this. They found her dead in her bed one morning. The doctor said it was heart disease, but it's my belief that her work here on earth was done. She had lived for her son William and raised him into a fine man for the past 20 years and saw him come into his rights. I tell you, dying for people is a lot easier than living for them anyhow. Now, the old squire did outlive Miley by many years, and when he died, young William came into all the Elroy property. You've seen the Elroy place, haven't you, child? That big white house with the big pillars and the porches in front of it. There's 3 miles of it along the pike, and folks will drive out there just to look at it. I've heard them call it the Colonial Mansion, or some name like that. It was just all run down when William came into possession of it, but now it's one of the finest places in the whole state. That's the way it is with families. One generation will tear it down, and another generation will build it up. And here's William, building up all that his father tore down. And I, for one, hope that his work lasts for many a days. Granny Tollett's voice ceased, and there was a long silence. The full harvest of storytelling was over, but sometimes there was an aftermath to Granny's tale, and for this I waited. I looked at the field opposite where the long, verdant rows gave promise of the autumn reaping, and my thoughts were busy tracing backward every link in the chain of circumstances that stretched between Miley Russell's boy of 40 years ago and the handsome, prosperous man that I had just seen this morning.
What an absolute masterpiece of storytelling. Stick around for more of the best of Granny Tollett. And we're back with one of my all-time favorite stories from Granny Tollett. This is The Old Dirt Road.
Make haste, child. There's mighty little time between lunch and sundown, and if we're going to town, we better get started, called Granny Tollett. Granny came out of the house, dressed in her best Sunday clothes. Her poke bonnet was draped with a veil of figured lace, and under the lace, her face beamed with happy anticipation, for a lifetime of trips to town hadn't dulled her enjoyment of such an event. Granny's horse and buggy stood at the gate. Oh, Granny Tollett could tell many wonderful tales about Nellie's spirit and speed in the days of her youth. Some remnant of the fire was supposed to smolder yet in the old thoroughbred, but as I looked at the drooping head and the half-shut eyes, I saw there was good reason for Granny Tollett's haste. If we were expected to get back from town before nightfall, we better get a moving. "What are we going to town for?" I asked as I stepped into the buggy. Granny hesitated for a moment. "I'm going to lay in an order for a supply of sugar and fabric, and I may buy some garden seeds, or one thing or another. I ain't exactly out of any of it, and I could get the seed from one of my neighbors. I reckon if the truth was told, I'm going to town just to be going." And that was the order of nature of things. When Granny had her mind set on something, well, there weren't a chance in the world of changing her way of thinking. So off we went, down the dusty road that led away from her farm. For a long time, we rode in silence, just listening to the sounds of nature. Granny Tollett was the first to speak. "Ain't it sweet and peaceful this time of year? Look at these pretty fields, and the woods all fenced in, with good roads running alongside." Just here, the road made a steep, upward curve, and we looked down on the clear, green ripples of a river that wound between the high rocky cliffs on one hand, and on the other, vast fields of corn growing lushly in the deep, rich soil. "Granny, why is a river as pretty as this one called Barren River?" I asked. "There isn't anything barren about this river that I can see." Granny Tollett's eyes sparkled. She was capable of answering the question, for it touched on a page of ancient history that was to her a twice-told tale. "You see all these trees, child?" she said impressively, waving her hand in the direction of the luxuriant masses of foliage. "Just look up yonder at that tulip tree. 80 feet high, I reckon, and the flowers standing up like there were gold candlesticks that the Bible tells about. You wouldn't think that all these trees could have grown up since the first settlers came through here, but I heard my grandpa tell it many times. He said the Indians used to set fire to the woods and the fields. And when the first settlers came through, they called this the Barrens on account there was no trees, and they just passed by all this good land, and they went further up on the Gasper River. And there were springs coming out of the hills and plenty of trees. You see, there's two things that a settler had to have, wood and water. That's why the country up around Gasper was settled before this was. And this got the name of the Barrens, when there ain't a richer lot of ground anywhere. And speaking of names, honey, did I ever tell you how Kettle Creek got its name? Well, now, folks has been laughing about this story for the last 75 years. And I reckon they'll keep on laughing, as long as there's an old man or an old woman like me living to tell it." And Granny began laughing in advance of the story. The right name of Kettle Creek is actually Clear Fork, but it's been Kettle Creek ever since old man Sam Stapleton gave it that name. And this is the way it happened. Old man Sam lived on the first side of the creek, and he had a habit of coming to town once in a while to lay in for his groceries and such things. And every time he'd come to town, he'd get his jug filled, of course, and drink it all the way home. But by the time he'd get to Clear Fork, he wouldn't know where he was, or who he was, or which way he was going. Now, he was a mighty good-hearted man, but I tell you, that jug was his besetting sin. Well, one evening, he was coming home the usual way, him and the jug, and he got to the creek, and he concluded that he would get off his horse and lay down and take a little nap. Well, some of the women folks in that neighborhood had been doing their washing that day, and there was a big old iron kettle just sitting on the bank, set up on some stones where they had piled their clothes. Old man Sam laid down by the kettle and went to sleep. Pretty soon, he got awake and sat up and rubbed his eyes, and he took notice of the kettle and he said, "Have I crossed this creek or not? It appears to me I've seen this kettle before, but whether it was on this side of the creek or the other, I can't say to save my life." Well, he studied it a while and he said, "I'll give myself the benefit of the doubt." So he crossed the creek. He got off his horse and he sat down in the shade. He took a drink out of that jug, and before he knew it, he had fell asleep again. After a while, he woke up and he looked around, and he said, "Well, here I am again, and there's that creek, and yonder's that old kettle, just as natural as life. But what I want to know is, am I going to town or am I coming back?" He took a look up at the sun and he said, "Well, judging by the way the sun looks, it might be 9 o'clock in the morning, or it might be 3 o'clock in the evening. I can't tell, so I reckon I'll take my chances and cross this creek." So across the creek he went. He took another drink and laid down and fell asleep right by the kettle. Pretty soon he woke up a third time and he said, "Well, if this ain't that old kettle again. Howdy, Mr. Kettle. Can you tell me which way I'm going, and whether it's morning or evening?" The kettle didn't answer, and the old man sat there and he thought a while, and he crossed the creek again. And wouldn't you know it, after another drink, he took another nap. And when he woke up, he said, "I've never seen so many blamed kettles in all my life as I've seen today. I reckon this must be Kettle Creek." I've always thought it was a shame to laugh at old Sam, but that old man told the Kettle Creek story on himself. I don't reckon he thought he was changing the name of Clear Fork Creek, but from that day on, nobody called it anything but Kettle Creek. Granny Tollett paused and joined in my laughter. In a moment, her keen eyes had detected a change in the road. There hadn't been any rain for a week, but the horse's hooves and the wheels of her buggy suddenly ceased to raise any dust. "It looks like there's been a shower here lately," she remarked. "But I don't see any sign of rain except for right here in the middle of the road." "Perhaps it's that new old road, Granny," I said. "Well, that's just what it is," she exclaimed. "Uncle Billy was a-telling me about this newfangled way they had to lay in the dust. But it didn't seem to me like oil would mix with dust any more than it would with water. But that just shows how little us old folks know. Well, ain't this nice? Riding along in the dry weather and never raising a bit of dust. You know Uncle Billy don't approve of these old roads. He claimed all those town folks would never get through trying to circumvent Providence. They've got their gas and their electricity, so it don't make a bit of difference to them whether the sun or the moon or the stars are shining or not. And they've got their electric fans, which makes them independent of the wind blowing. And now they're fixing their roads, so they won't even have to pray for rain. It looks like they're trying to get rid of the sense of all dependence on the Almighty. But I've always said that I feel thankful for Providence, that He made the oil, and that He made people smart enough to know that oil will settle to dust. Son, there ain't no use sticking to the old ways unless they're better than the new ways. Granny Tollett stopped and peered over the side of the buggy. Just then there were a whirl of wings from the fence corner, and a moment later, a liquid voice sounded over the clover field from a Bob White. Most birds have a song but one season, Granny said. You take the bluebird, for instance. She sings only of spring. But the two simple notes of the Bob White, there's a melody of falling water, a song of April's pale green fields, a song of summer's golden grain, and another of autumn's scarlet leaves and frosty mornings. And that's a voice that won't be here much longer. And when it does stop, it'll be like missing a voice in the church choir. The wild things are disappearing one by one, and I'm bound to say the first settlers was a good deal to blame for it all. You see, game was so plentiful in them early days that nobody thought about it ever giving out. Every man was a hunter. Heck, they had to be to provide his family with meat. And I've heard my father say that every boy in them days was born with a gun in his hands. Old Jonathan Petty, Silas's father, he had 9 sons, and all of them was sharpshooters. They used to shoot at squirrels for target practice. And if they hit that squirrel anywhere but in the head, old Jonathan would give them a good whipping. And that sort of training is bound to make any boy a good marksman. But it was hard on the squirrels. Just then, Granny sensed something in the air. Do you smell that? But the truth is, I didn't smell anything. Strawberries, child, strawberries. Didn't you ever smell strawberries when the evening sun's shining on them and ripening them and the wind's blowing over them just like it's a-blowing now? There's a 10-acre patch of strawberries just over there across that meadow. It was impossible to go on with that perfume a-blowing, and it went like a far-off, exquisite voice. And for a moment, even Granny forgot her hurry to get to town as we sat with our faces eagerly turned towards the unseen field of strawberries. I've heard folks say that Kentucky is the natural home of the strawberry. And I reckon so, for I recollect how, when I was a child, the strawberries grew wild in the pastures, and cows would come home at night with their hooves dyed red from the juice of the berries that they'd been treading on all day. Parson Page used to say there were some things that showed the goodness of the Lord, and some things, such as strawberries and grapes and apples and peaches, that showed the exceedingly great goodness of the Lord. He'd never eat a strawberry without first holding it up and looking at it and smelling it, and he'd say, "Now, wouldn't you think that it was enough to have a strawberry tasting like it does? But here it is, the prettiest color in the world, pretty as any rose, and besides that, smelling like the sweetest flower that grows." What is the sweetest flower that grows, Granny? Don't ask me such a question as that. Every one of them's the sweetest while I'm smelling it. The world's full of sweet things, child, and you don't have to look to gardens to find them either. They're scattered around everywhere, for free for everybody. Just look yonder at that old fence corner. There's catnip and horehound and horse mint and pennyroyal, and pretty soon they'll be wild everlasting. Yes, it's a mighty sweet world, and I'm glad I've lived in it this long. And heaven will have to be mighty fine if it's any better than this old earth. You see that pretty farm yonder? Granny Tollett said as she pointed to the left. Look at those fields just as level as a parlor floor and soil like a river bottom. That farm belonged to Henry Amos, Sam Amos's younger brother. Well, Henry got gold fever back in '48. Him and a lot of other young fellas, and nothing would get their mind off of going to California. And here's Henry's farm. But where Henry is, nobody knows. Every time I see that yellow wheat standing in these fields, I think of how Henry's grandfather begged him not to go. Henry was his favorite grandchild, and it broke the old man's heart to see him leave. He took hold of Henry's hand and led him through the front door, and he said, "Son, do you think the Lord was so forgetful of his children that he put all the gold in the world out yonder in California? That potato patch over there is a gold mine, and there's a gold mine in that wheat field, and another one in that corn field. And if you go down to the orchard and gather a load of them apples and a few pumpkins, and you haul them to town and sell them, you'll find there's some gold in them too. The whole earth is a gold mine. if men just have the patience to dig it out. But Henry went to California anyways, and I reckon he couldn't help it, that poor boy. Some folks are born to stay at home, and some are born with the wandering fever in their bones. I took a look at the fertile fields that were the dead man's heritage and pondered for a moment the old story of restless human ambition that loses the near and the familiar by grasping at the far-fetched and the unknown. By now, we were nearing the town limits. Instead of the infrequent farmhouses, we were now passing rows of pretty new suburban homes, which seemed to further erode closer and closer into the countryside, with now and then only a fine old elm standing next to the roadside. Granny Tollett's face wore the look of a pilgrim who approaches a beautiful city. In her nature, she had the power to love the country without hating the city. But for me, apart from Granny's company, going to town had no attraction for me. Town was only a necessary evil to whose sum we call civilization. And while Granny took delighted notice of the newly laid concrete walks and the shiny cars with the rumbling engines, my heart turned regretfully back towards the narrow wayside path, bordered by its dusty weeds and watered only by the dew and the rain, the old dirt road. To this very day, I wish the road would have been longer, at a much slower speed, and just a little more time to listen to Granny's stories.